The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, a senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, today we're going to be talking about the China-Africa trade relationship. Of course, trade is something that sits in the background of every discussion that goes on about China and Africa, but we really haven't had a chance in a while to dive into the numbers. And we thought that this would be a good time because China's Ministry of Commerce recently released the 2018 trade figures that came out between China and Africa. And there is some good news. The numbers are up sharply, almost 20%, about 19% to $204.5 billion in bilateral trade between China and Africa. Now, just to give you some perspective, that's a big number. There's no doubt about it. But it's less than what China does in trade with Germany and significantly less than what China does in trade with South America, which is now up at around $260 billion. So there is a good story here. But at the same time, when we look at these numbers a little bit deeper, some problems start to emerge. And this is why it's important to separate the propaganda from the reality. So Chinese media and state media will talk about, wow, the blooming trade between China and Africa. But when you look at it, 40 African countries are in the red and have trade deficits with China. Some of them very, very large, in particular Kenya, for example. Others, the trade itself is highly, highly distorted. So about 70% of the trade is concentrated into minerals, timber, and oil, the extractive resources. And of that, most of it is into about 10 to 15 different African countries. So China's trade across Africa is not spread out evenly. And Cobus, I think that's actually a cause for concern, despite the fact that the overall number is up.
This is definitely a point of concern in Africa, and it's that concern is being sharpened at the moment because, as we record, Africa is about to formally kick off the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's supposed to come into action, this month. And, with it, there's a lot of hope, that especially that Africa will be able to increase its intracontinental trade and that it will be able to get better trade deals with international partners. But at the same time, there's also a lot of concern that the situation we see now will be exacerbated, that there'll be a flood of Chinese-made goods kind of flooding into the continent and that trade imbalances will become even steeper.
So we wanted to get some perspective on the China-Africa trade relationship, and we thought it'd be the best person to do this would be Hannah Ryder, who's the CEO of Development Reimagined, which is a development consultancy based in Beijing. Hannah herself is an old friend of our program going back years and years and years. Also, former United Nations Development Program leader in China. And a former diplomat, and has been around the China-Africa trading relationship for a long time. And we appreciate, Hannah, that you're back with us and staying up very, very late and joining us on the line from Beijing.
Thank you very much for having me, Eric and Cobus. It's great to be here again.
It's wonderful to have you, and it's wonderful to be able to talk about trade and start looking into these numbers. And it really gets to, let's do a health check of the China-Africa economic relationship. It's, of course, really showcased by the Chinese as one of their more productive, proactive, healthy economic relationships around the world. But when you see the $204.5 billion bilateral trade number, and when you look at the state of China-Africa trade as it is today, what's your reaction?
Well, China-Africa trade, as you say, it has been rising for a long time, and China has been Africa's overall largest trade partner since 2008. But these large figures do mask a whole range of challenges, not necessarily unique to China, and I think we should explore that a little bit. But the fact that almost 40 of the African countries do have this trade deficit with China. And in terms of that overall trade balance, for every single dollar that is exported to China, $1.6 comes back to the African continent. So it is an overall imbalance which at some point needs to be corrected. And actually, at the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, which happened in September last year, there was a big emphasis on how to correct this trade imbalance, and particularly because, we've got on the African continent 600 million people who are unemployed, 600 million youth. At the same time, here is a country that is in China that is expected to have 500 million consumers middle-class consumers by 2022. The growth in China of consumer markets is really strong compared to the rest of the world, 16% compared to, let's say, 2% in the US. So there is an opportunity for African nations to be able to tap into the Chinese market, but somehow it's not quite happening for the majority of the African countries.
And Hannah, what do you see as some of the biggest obstacles to African countries being able to close that gap?
Well, I think there's several obstacles, and I think we should also put this in context in the fact that China does have a trade deficit that African countries have a trade deficit with China is not necessarily unusual. So even the European Union, you still get similar trends for the US. 60% of African countries have got a trade deficit with the US, 70% with China. So it's not unusual. But the challenge is that majority of African countries are getting huge imports from China. And yes, there is this opportunity on the other side. The barrier is there are several barriers. First of all, there's a huge focus on raw materials, imports of raw materials into China and also elsewhere. So first of all, that means that there's very little added value of the products that come into China. And then for the products that go out of China, they're typically, manufactured and have a higher value. And the other barrier is also the overall amounts of trade. So China, for example, of the overall balance of its trade, only 4% of China's imports come from the African continent. Other countries do have more, others have less. So US, 2% come from Africa. But UK, for example, 5.4% comes from Africa. So you do have a real range of amounts of trade coming in, but it's clearly, however much the trade is increasing, there is clearly the fact that Africa is losing out in comparison to many other regions in how it's able to take advantage of trade relationships and move ahead.
Well, let's take a look at some solutions and look, can this actually be solved? And because I have to be honest with you, I look at some of the numbers and I don't see a way out. China exports about $3.8 billion worth of goods to Kenya. Kenya sells back to China about $167 million, mostly agricultural products. That is a gap I just don't understand how they're ever going to close. It's a similar story what we see in places like Senegal and other resource-deficient countries. In those with oil and the key resources, there's a different set of problems, that China has tied up a lot of those resources in loan for infrastructure and resource for infrastructure deals.
Yeah, that's right. You do see this huge range of trade relationships with China, and as you say, you have the extractive countries countries that do have a lot of natural resources are sending a lot more in terms of their exports to China and really making up for the rest of the continent. But what's the fact is, how do you close that gap? Well, first of all, there's several different steps. First of all, the Chinese market has to open up to African products. This is something that a lot of African governments are working on. Here in China, in order to be able to bring in goods into China, and especially agricultural products, which is where a lot of the African governments are focused on, You have to have a whole range of certification. You have to have gone through some quarantine processes and so on. The standard agency from China is most likely to have visited. One example is with Kenya has just negotiated for avocados to come into China. Whereas a lot of countries, you don't have this kind of negotiation or very, very lengthy process. You do, of course, have some standards, but they are not as stringent as China's are. So that is one barrier, just literally opening up the market and removing what are known in trade circles as non-trade barriers, because actually a lot of the African countries already have zero tariffs on their products with China. So that's typically not the issue. Even middle-income countries, a lot of them, like Kenya, have zero tariffs, but it's these non-tariff barriers that get in the way. The other issue is about manufacturing, and this I think is really important and something which is not typically recognized in the debate, that the fact that there is not much manufacturing taking place on the African continent actually also inhibits the ability of countries to be able to shift the trade deficit, whether it's with China, whether it's with the UK, Germany, a whole range of different countries. Just take the example that the African Development Bank have just been talking about in a recent report. They were talking about cocoa. The African continent gets 5% of the value of the overall chocolate market, which is valued at $100 billion, but it produces 75% of the world's cocoa. You're not going to be able to, even things like fair trade are not going to be able to shift that pattern. You actually have to really make huge steps in terms of shifting global supply chains to move onto the African continent in order for African countries to really start to shift the trade deficits with the rest of the world, including China.
Another solution that's frequently mentioned is the idea of Chinese companies outsourcing to Africa. I've read some analysts saying that, when we started discussing this a few years ago, a lot of people pointed out that, it would be much more likely for these businesses to outsource to places like Vietnam. More recently, I've read analysts saying that Vietnam is itself, starting to become a more expensive place to produce, and that a place like Ethiopia is actually leading the way in extremely low wage assembly and manufacturing, and that more companies are actually now starting to outsource to places like Ethiopia. Does that look to you like a kind of that could be a significant wave in the future, or is that to a certain extent a false narrative?
Well, from our perspective, we definitely hope that it is, because, look, if you look at the Agenda 2063, which is the kind of overall vision for the African continent developed by the African leaders and the African Union and the UN together, they're looking at increasing manufacturing. They're looking at trying to create new jobs across the continent, with that view that industrialization and outsourcing from China is going to be really it's going to be a major component of that strategy. And in other words, what that means is Chinese companies investing on the African continent, moving their factories to Africa. And of course, it is happening. I think in the figures that MOFCOM recently released that Eric was talking about earlier, we've seen an increase of $3.3 billion in foreign direct investment from China into Africa. So that is positive, but it's not really enough as yet. And we absolutely believe there's a huge amount of awareness raising to be done here in China. When you speak to Chinese counterparts, and especially, kind of when you go out to the provinces and you say, okay, so what African countries do you know about? And what do you know them for? You hear some companies saying, yes, okay, we know Ethiopia, because Ethiopia has started to really develop a reputation especially for textiles, manufacturing and apparel. They know Kenya for animals, South Africa for being a generally good investment destination, and Nigeria for its large population. But, that's 4 African countries out of 55 that are all really trying to get and really trying to structure their business environments to be able to attract more manufacturing. So this is really, there's a great deal to be done. The other point as well is also, again, in China, and I think across the world, it's this perception that what is possible in Africa is really just simple manufacturing at best, not very well skilled labor, and that what's possible is really just to focus on agricultural goods. Nothing really finished and at the highest quality. We really don't see enough. There's too many stereotypes about what is possible in the African continent that we also need to turn around across the world, but especially in China, just because there's so little awareness of what really happens.
I was recently in Beijing, and when I had a chance to see you, and I held a number of seminars, and we participated in a couple ourselves, and I was surprised by how many people who were there, Chinese folks who were there, who were part of either think tanks or consultancies or agencies helping Chinese businesses find opportunities in Africa. It was at several of the events I went to, some of the attendees were there. So clearly, as you say, there's interest. And one of the topics that came up in the discussions that I had with them was, how is the current U.S.-China trade conflict affecting how Chinese may be looking to other parts of the world to make up for what they used to buy from the United States and now are buying, say, soybeans from Brazil and Russia. Tell me a little bit about what you're hearing on the ground. Is Africa benefiting at all from the U.S.-China kind of tiff, or is this something that is causing more concern for African countries on the trade front?
Well, it really depends what country representative you speak to. A country like South Africa, for example, is doing their best to take advantage of the of potential new markets, but at the same time is suffering because they've got steel exports that go to the US and so on. So this trade war is actually really damaging for them. Whereas other countries that effectively, don't get a look in, that have the large deficits with China and also with the US, are just saying, well, when is this going to happen? How can we accelerate that process to be able to get something out of this potential opportunity? There's this huge market growing. They can see it. They see the consumption rising. In Beijing, the consumption is just absolutely incredible. So well developed, but how do African governments actually get a look in? And there is definitely a sense of frustration, but also a feeling that really there has to be a lot more work put in order to make this happen. The problem is, of course, that many of the African governments just simply do not have the finance and even the teams here in Beijing to be able to negotiate and push hard for the outcomes that they really want. So that's something that we really try and take a role in, but it is really challenging. That's for sure.
How do you see the Continental Free Trade Agreement impacting the kind of China-Africa trade landscape?
Well, it's certainly positive, and here in China it's being received very, very positively because it does mean it makes it easier to promote African countries to potential investors, to potential to factories who are moving over, because they can have a larger they can source their materials from different countries, but they can also have a larger domestic market within Africa. So I think there's definitely it's definitely been seen quite positively, but to the effect that it really affects the bottom line for these Chinese companies. Part of the challenge is that, first of all, logistics still are a major challenge across the different countries. And so obviously things like the air traffic aspect of the free trade agreement also need to improve. And they're also still the domestic markets, even though it's growing, in Africa, China's growing faster. China's consumption is growing faster. So, and there's a much larger market here. So part of the question is also even if Chinese companies do move to Africa and start to take advantage of the free trade area, how can they also then export back to China as well, which is something which is also a kind of very emerging area of work. And we're trying to encourage some of the factories to be thinking in this kind of way, not just to be looking only at the domestic market. Fundamentally, the future should be, of course, in a green way, because we've got to care about climate change. Africa is suddenly, slowly becoming the manufacturing hub of the world. But that is going to take time, and it's going to take a concerted effort from a whole range of people.
Support for this podcast comes from the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University School of Journalism in Johannesburg. The ACRP provides reporting grants, workshops, and other professional development opportunities for both African and Chinese journalists. Follow the ACRP on Twitter at Wits China Africa or visit africachinareporting.co.za for information about grants and upcoming seminars.
Let's go back to the kind of solution side of the discussion here. We touched on it a little bit earlier. China clearly recognizes that they have a problem in their trade balance with Africa. And Xi Jinping, China's president, said as much back in February when he convened this giant confab called the Import Expo. Now, a lot of people looking back on the Import Expo saw this more as a political event than an actual trade or an economic event. That's subject to some interpretation. But again, it was an acknowledgement that says, if you come and participate, kiss the Chinese ring, you might have access into this vast consumer market, as you've been talking about. But then there was a follow-up meeting that they announced that's coming up, and it's coming up later in June in Changsha, Hunan province, which is, I want to ask, so I have a two-part question. Why would they put a China-Africa trade import expo in Hunan province? That's question number one, because that didn't make sense immediately to me. And question number two is, what are they going to be doing at it? And is this just maybe more grandstanding, or is there actually some substance in these types of conventions where they're bringing together Africans and Chinese to talk about trade?
Okay, Eric, two really good questions. Your first one, I cannot answer, I'm afraid.
Doesn't it seem
all
random
I know
to
is
you? I mean, it just seems like, okay, good. Then I'm not the only one who's confused about this, because I couldn't find any information as to why
it's happening.
But here's the weird thing, though. I just learned today that in Hunan province, which is in the south on the Vietnamese border, they have a thriving African studies program at the universities there, several universities there.
Right.
Which is can't figure that one out either.
Look, so it's fascinating. Once you start to travel around China, actually, you realize there's a whole number of... Have you been to Yiwu, Eric?
Yiwu, yes. I mean, it's like that's one of the big trading ports, and there's a huge export business to Africa.
A huge African community there, but hardly anybody talks about them. And they're all coordinating and doing quite well as businesses. So, whereas we all only think about Guangzhou, and then, you think about these different universities, you hear about universities only, China-Africa universities only in Zhejiang province, but actually they're all over. So, we all need to do a lot more kind of homework as to where are the activities.
Okay, we'll move on to our second one, which is these, when these delegations come over from Africa, spend a lot of money. It's not cheap. And they spend a lot of time, and they meet with their Chinese counterparts or Chinese buyers or whatnot. And you were at the Import Expo in Shanghai back in February. Are these productive, worthwhile events, or are they just more kind of grandstanding?
Look, I think expos can be useful. I think the challenge with Shanghai, and we spoke to a lot of African businesses who came to Shanghai with the expectation that they'd be finding an easy way to market their products. It was absolutely humongous, and also there were there were exporters from all over the world there. So the fact that we've got China Africa Expo is certainly good in terms of bringing more focus and attention to African countries where these opportunities and the poverty reduction, sustainable development really needs to be focused. So I think that's really welcome. But I think the challenge with expos, and especially for African countries and businesses, is they assume a level of understanding about the market that you're in. And actually, once you live in China, you realize first of all, it's a very dynamic environment. The trends are changing constantly. Retail trends are very different. We've got e-commerce that has risen really strongly in the last 5-10 years. And keeping track of what Chinese consumers want and like is extremely challenging. So, there is a lot of experience, and you have, take what we saw in Shanghai. You could see that, businesses from countries like Australia or the UK had actually, come together to create something much more kind of exciting, as it were, to attract. But they were also building the capacity by having, chambers of commerce and so on, who were able to help them navigate and follow up what they'd done, what they might do at the expo. Because that, once you come to an expo, well, what are you going to do after? How do you follow up with a potential distributor and supplier? How did you make sure that the potential distributor and supplier actually came to you in the first place? How did you know that they were the right ones? Did you have translation? There are a whole set of challenges that these African businesses were facing, and they don't have the kinds of support, chambers of commerce that businesses in Australia, US, etc. that do have here in China. So this is an area that really needs to be in terms of if African businesses, African countries are going to get the most out of an opportunity like the Expo, there definitely needs to be a whole range of support around their participation and support provided consistently going forwards, including from in China, not just in their own countries. And it's a real gap that we see, and we find it so frustrating. But we're really trying to work with a whole set of new partners to say, look, you do all these aid for trade programs, you do, there's lots of ideas around trilateral cooperation between China and Switzerland, Germany. Why not actually start to think, how can you support African business and African countries from within China to take the opportunity that there is here in this market? And the Expo is a great opportunity for kind of anchoring that, but nevertheless, it's only one small step in what's really required.
And when you're advising these governments and they make clear to you, like, look, we have a very limited budget and we have relatively low capacity. What are some of the kind of relatively low hanging fruit that they can actually focus on, initially in order to kind of get that first kind of like foot on the lowest rung?
Yeah. Well, I think there are several things that they can do. They can, of course, try to work out what they feel are their most important products that they want to get into China. They can think strategically about that. Take for Kenya, for example, as I mentioned, they've been trying to get avocados into China and have just had an agreement for that. But the tea is Kenya's largest export to lots of other countries. China ranks only 29th as a tea consumer from Kenya. So they can actually start to prioritize which are the most important agricultural products, or in order to start kind of bringing more products. On the other hand, they can also, at the same time, also engage with some of their leading brands in their countries. And some of these brands are and what these brands do is they can showcase the ability to kind of have an entire supply chain within one country or within a region in Africa, and show that it's possible to have the full supply chain and the finished product, very high quality finished product from a country in and showcase that in China. So we're suggesting that they have a kind of two-pronged approach to that, and also just between themselves exchange expertise and exchange information about how they have gone through these different negotiations. Also speak to the Latin Americans with avocados, for example. Kenya should be speaking to Chile, who import 50% of China's of the imports into China. They cover over 50% of the market. They should be speaking to them and saying, okay, well, how did you actually negotiate this, even before they begin the negotiation with China, so that they also understand what the loopholes might be and how Kenyan companies and Kenyan small holders can get the most out of that relationship, get the most out of whatever trade agreement comes in there. And we see, look, if the US finds it difficult, everyone else is going to find it difficult, right? And so I think it's not a simple process, and these governments really need a great deal of support.
Quickly before we go, because I know it's getting late for those of us in China, one last question, but I want to shift gears a little bit to the question of debt. And debt and trade are linked intimately in the African-China context, in the sense that a lot of governments were taking on enormous amounts of debt on the premise that African economies are going to continue to grow, the investment in infrastructure will generate economic activity, and all of that will then lead to paying off these debts. Happy story. Everybody's content, right? Well, in this economic environment that we're in, there's a lot of concern that commodity prices are flat and falling. There are higher interest rates in places like Zambia on Eurobonds. In fact, Zambia's Eurobond rate shot up to 19.74% a couple weeks ago. So there's a lot of variabilities now in this relationship. Development Reimagined, your group in Beijing, came out with recently some data that was very, very interesting about how China is not only not calling in these debts, but actually showing some restraint in how they manage their debt relationships in Africa by canceling, rescheduling, or otherwise negotiating with their different partners in various African countries to do this. This, of course, flies in the face of the debt trap narrative that we've heard quite a bit coming out of places like Washington. So talk to us a little bit about the relationship between debt and trade and some of the findings that you came up with in your report that you published earlier this year.
That's a really good question. What we do with the public research that we publish, for example, this one on debt, which we actually did with a group of students in Oxford University, we try to look at the question, how does China compare to others? So we try and put what China's doing in context and not take it out of context and see and check whether there are international experience that can be drawn on, and also help African countries especially, but also others around the world. This piece on debt restructuring and cancellation covered the entire world. How can they better understand their relationship in context in comparison to other developing countries in particular? So with this work on debt, we wanted to see whether China is unusual in canceling more or less debt compared to other countries who have engaged in debt cancellation initiatives. For example, whether it's the US, Germany, UK. Is China different, and who are the countries that have benefited most from the debt cancellation, and can they share examples? Can they share their experiences with others who might be going through these same sorts of processes? So we didn't want to speculate about, is there going to be more debt cancellation or not? What we did find was that there is a strong relationship between, we looked at whether debt and trade relationships are linked. We didn't actually find that those countries that trade more with China or less have more or less debt cancellation. We didn't find anything significant there, but we did find something significant when it came to foreign direct investment. So this question of if you've got more foreign direct investment with China, as in from China, then it seemed that from the data that we had that you require less debt cancellation. So this was a really interesting finding because it does kind of reinforce the importance of trying to encourage, and especially for the African countries, trying to encourage them to continue to attract the Chinese manufacturers, continue to open up their business environments, but also and from the Chinese side to provide more and more incentives, because the more incentives that they provide for foreign direct investment, maybe the less they'll have to get into these difficult discussions around debt cancellation. So we're providing a different solution to, what others who are very critical of China might be in terms of, okay, well, if it's debt diplomacy, then let's actually just stop this relationship completely. No, we're not saying that. We're saying, okay, try and see whether there's other activities that you can do, reinforce and work strategically with China in order to get something more out of that relationship. And so this was I think something helpful for governments, and we hope it was helpful for citizens as well in terms of understanding how much debt has been cancelled or not with their different countries.
Yeah, I mean, it was incredibly helpful, and I really encourage everybody to go to the Development Reimagined website. Just look up developmentreimagined.org and you will find it, and just search on the website for it, because anytime you have the discussion over the debt trap narrative, this is the type of data that actually challenges it. Again, I think to Hannah's point, there's a lot of gray here, so there's nothing really definitive, but at least this is a data point we can point to that helps us better understand what the situation is. So it's an invaluable piece of research, and congratulations to you and the team for doing it. It's helped me. I think it's helped a lot of people. So I hope that we're going to see more of this data. It would be great if actually China produced some of this data themselves and were nice enough to share it with everybody, but that might be asking a little too much right now. So in the meantime, we're happy that you guys are doing it. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us. Hannah Ryder, everybody, is the CEO of Development Reimagined, a consultancy based in Beijing. There are few people out there who are as well-versed in the China-Africa relationship on all fronts. So we talk trade tonight, but she's also well-versed in the economic, the cultural, every aspect of it. And it's a great resource for us and for to be able to share your insights with everybody. If people want to follow what both you and Development Reimagined are doing on social media, what's the best way for them to stay in touch with you?
So for Development Reimagined, we have a Twitter account. It's DEV Reimagined, Dev Reimagined, and then we also have a LinkedIn site as well, which we just started. So you can also follow our activities there. And for myself, you can also follow me on HM Ryder, RYDER there. So
RYDER. Well, thank you so much for staying up late again with us. We really appreciate it, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us. And listen, best of luck at the in Hunan, and maybe you can find out why they're holding this in Hunan, and
I will
please share with us.
certainly do that. Most certainly. I have
very,
seen
very
pictures
interested
of
in
this,
this.
of this huge expo, and of where the expo is going to be, and it will be pretty huge and impressive. So, actually, looking forward to it quite a bit.
No doubt. And there is a reason. We just need to find out why. So we look forward to hearing from that. Thank you so much, Hannah Ryder. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Cobus. Bye.
Cobus, in so much of the China-Africa relationship, we're confronted with these contradictions. So on the one hand, again, trade is up 20% to $204.5 billion in 2018. That's a good thing. But as Hannah pointed out, there are trade deficits in 40 different countries. So much of that trade is really distorted. I am skeptical that a country like Kenya can export its way out of this deficit in using avocados and tea. It's going to take a lot more than that. Interestingly, on my trip to Beijing, I met with a couple China-Africa traders, mostly they're Kenyans, and they were very, very kind of frustrated, not with the Chinese side, but they were frustrated with their Kenyan counterparts, how the customs controls and the regulations are getting more complicated, how corruption is a problem, how things are sitting at the port longer, how so facilitating trade between the two, the operational parts of it, are so difficult on the Kenyan side. And he was just furious. And another guy was saying, a lot of the same things as well. So when we get down to the nitty gritty, are avocados and tea and agricultural products going to balance out the huge trade deficit? Probably not. Adding in some value into those exports from places like Kenya and South Africa, that's got to happen, but it's not happening fast enough. The debt sustainability issues are also part of this, because unless the African countries can add value to those exports, those debts are rising, the interest payments are mounting, and we face a big problem. So again, we're conflicted. Is this good news? Is it bad news? Is it good enough news? But it's not a simple, good and bad story.
Yeah, no, definitely not. I mean, the fact that so much of that trade is still in raw, unprocessed resources is another big problem. Not only economically but also environmentally. Because these extractive industries tend to be some of the most destructive environmentally. So that's another issue. It's going to be very interesting to see how the kicking off of the free trade agreement. One of the things that also kicks off is a whole bunch of intra-African tariffs are falling away. So there's going to be kind of a continent-wide kind of rejiggering of the bureaucracy and the tariff systems and the tax systems, across all of these different boundaries. And so it's, kind of that in the longer run, that might, kind of help to also kick off a kind of a streamlining of these systems that would maybe in the long run make it easier, for everyone trading with Africa. But yeah, these processes take so long, and there's still so much that needs to be done. So it's difficult to be super optimistic.
But at least trade is not going down. We saw numbers from 2015, 16, and 17, and that number was dipping down. And you and I were talking about then is China losing interest in Africa. So that doesn't seem to be happening, at least on the trade relationship. So it's encouraging there. I suspect that China is going to start leaning in to Africa and more Belt and Road countries as the relationship with the United States continues to evolve and deteriorate. That is most likely going to happen in the next 12 to 18 months rather quickly, as the Chinese need to start sourcing suppliers from all these different regions. South America is probably going to benefit the most. Russia is already starting to export soybeans that was originally coming from the United States. So we're going to see a lot coming from Asia, but Africa, if it can position itself well, some of these countries on the continent are well positioned to take advantage of this. But Cobus, as you pointed out, they do need to get their act together in terms of adding value to those exports, no doubt there. So that'll do it for this edition. We're going to continue to talk about trade. Hey, before we go, I just want to give a big thank you to the United Nations Development Program, to DFID, and to a number of the wonderful hosts who welcomed me to Beijing for a week of meetings and seminars and briefings and sessions. And it was great to see everybody and also to see so many listeners of the program and the podcast at the amazing China-Africa Stories event that was put on by Kente and Silk. They put on an amazing discussion, bringing together young Chinese professionals with African professionals, doing cultural exchanges, workshops, fashion shows. It was a whole week of activities. They deserve all of the praise and credit in the world. And if you are a corporate sponsor looking to do a good thing, find Kente and Silk and sponsor China-Africa Stories next year. They need it. They deserve it. It's an awesome event. That's my little unsolicited. I don't get a commission, by the way. Just want to put that out there, but I just want to let everybody know. Cobus, maybe next year you and I can go together. Yes. So many of our followers and on social media and also listeners to the program. So a big shout out to all of you. I'll be in Washington this summer, so and I'm starting to kind of fill up the schedule in Washington in the month of July. So if you would like me to stop by and chat and love to meet, send me an email and I'll kind of see if the schedule works out. I'm only there for a limited time, but nonetheless, I do want to kind of put a call out and a shout out to let everybody know that I'll be passing through Washington, D.C. in mid-July, and so I would love to meet folks and get together. And hopefully, Cobus, you and I have to do this at one point.
Yes. Yeah, together, definitely. I mean, I will also be in Washington in June, like mid-June. So yeah,
Yeah,
same
how
thing
is
for
it
me.
possible that we're just missing each other by a few weeks?
I
But
know.
and one of these days we're going to do a meetup in the same city together. It's going to be like in London, or we'll be in Beijing, and we'll say, okay, we're going to be at this bar for the next 3 hours. Come over if you want to meet us. But so Cobus and I will be on the road this summer. We love meeting you. We love connecting with you. And that's great. Another way, by the way, to stay in touch with us is through our newsletter. We got some exciting changes coming to the newsletter this summer. So sign up now. Go to our website. You'll see the signups. You can use the QR code right there on the homepage. If you get in now, by the time that the new changes come out, you'll be already signed up. Every week, what we do is we put together a selection of the top China-Africa news of the week, including some research from the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins, or from Brookings, or from some of the think tanks in Beijing, research like Development Reimagined. It's a great place both for students and scholars, as well as business people, politicians, anybody interested in this topic. This is a great thing. Cobus and I put it together every weekend. So on Monday, when you start your day, or start your week, it's there waiting for you. So again, ChinaAfricaProject.com. You can sign up for it right on the homepage. We'd love to have you part of that community. Okay, we'll be back again next week with another show. Until then, for Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/ChinaAfricaProject to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at @eOlander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China and Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.